is Charlotte Bell. Okay, recording. Um, I'm doing a PhD at the University of Liverpool where I focus on women in Roman Britain and their misrepresentation, notably through mortuary evidence. And I'm using a data set of Romano-British female and late Iron Age burial deposits, as well as Romano-British tombstones. So, as part of my dataset, I went out and visited all the institutions and museums that stored these tombstones that I needed, and I conducted an epigraphic analysis on them. As a result, I noticed that there was a lot of crescent moon iconography on these tombstones. And I've had lots of conversations with different curators, and they're actually asking me, what does this mean? And I thought to myself, wow, so people don't actually know what this means. In fact, some signposts for these tombstones are saying this may possibly be a rosette. However, it's quite clearly a crescent moon, and you'll see that in a few examples and slides here. So that got me curious and made me want to research deeper into this. I did look into previous research, and there's only one article that's been published on this topic in 2023, which also included medieval and other time periods and cultures. So, as far as I know, no one has really looked into this for Roman Britain. So this talk really just goes a lot more deeper into this subject. So during my research of Romano-British women and their evidence in the epigraphic data, I came across numerous examples of the crescent moon in relief form. So as I said before, some curators didn't have any knowledge of this. So that gap in knowledge really made me curious. So I used the Roman Inscriptions of Britain website, which I'm sure you're aware of, and I located all the inscriptions with the crescent moon motif. Now, this took a while. There's about 3,500 inscriptions on there, and I need to manually go through them all. If you use the search bar, it doesn't always come up with anything. For instance, I used the keyword crescent and the keyword moon, and 3 came up, and there's not 3. So so I used that website to locate all of them. And I also researched the type of persons connected with this stone. So if it's a tombstone, it's going to be, say, the dedicator, because they were ultimately responsible for erecting that tombstone, but also the person dedicated. So that iconography would have been closely associated with their status and their identity. But we're not only just seeing this in tombstones, we're also seeing it in deity dedications and building dedications and also emperor dedications. So when I looked into the type of persons that this was connected to, I realised that actually they were persons of both high and low social status, as well as women and men. And it was also used in commemoration, religious and military contexts. So that actually made it more confusing, because this motif was not exclusively associated with only high status or only women or only men or only in certain type of contexts. So this wide context really caused further questions. So I've decided to use a materiality approach to consider the ways people actually engaged with the motif. So using this epigraphic analysis, I needed to identify certain patterns in this motif to ultimately come to an understanding of what this meant and what significance it had, and possibly what function it served as well. So I looked at the origins, firstly, of the crescent moon and what it could possibly refer to. And that ultimately can contribute to our understanding of its meaning and function within an ancient society. So the most obvious connection was the deity Luna. So Luna was the daughter of Hyperion and Thea, and Hyperion was the Titan god of heavenly light, and he was also one of the 12 children of Gaia and Uranus. Thea was actually Hyperion's sister, who was also the goddess of light. But the Titans were the oldest gods, and they preceded the next generation of the Roman gods of Olympus. But it's actually believed that Luna predates Romulus and Remus and the foundation of Rome at 753. So Luna herself, she was the divine embodiment of the moon, and she formed a deity triad with Diana and, I'm going to butcher this name, Hecate. If someone can tell me what the proper pronunciation is after, that would be great. But I'm just going to say Hecate. So they represented the earth and the underworld. So the crescent represented femininity and childbirth, which is through the phases of the moon. However, it also referenced sublunar life. So if we look at the historic records, we can see that Suetonius attributed the moon to the wind, the rain, the tides, animal life, mineral growth, and earthquakes. So that really indicates that not only women were attracted to the worship of Luna, and Luna was associated strongly with agriculture as well. Varro actually states that Luna's seasons are observed at sowing and harvesting, and her courses are watching all manners of planting and harvesting. So the moon, and by extension Luna, was significant in agricultural life. And then if we look further at these historic records, Cicero stated that the moon advances pregnancies and ripens them into birth, and it's the source of conception and of growth and maturity. Luna was also believed to have been responsible for masking reality, piercing illusion, awakening intuition, and sparking visions. And she was also responsible for coming to people in dreams, and was also known as the patron of solutions. So, although Luna's presence was strong at Rome, we can actually see evidence of her worship in London. Maybe not to the degree at Rome, but we can see that the evidence is there. So, if we look at archaeological evidence, for instance, there's been 168 pipe clay figurines which were discovered in London, and 2 of those represented Luna. Now, if we think how she's being depicted, she was pictured as a pale, beautiful woman with long, shining black hair, and she was riding in a 2-yoke silver chariot, which typically she was depicted being pulled by 2 horses, but they also could have been 2 oxen or dragons. And she was also seen holding a torch in her hand, and as you can see in the image on the top left, she would have a crescent moon laying on above her forehead. However, some of the stones that I've encountered with moon reliefs also have a star within it. So that made me second guess the lunar interpretation and think, okay, maybe there's a different interpretation for this. So if we look at the star and crescent motif, that was strongly associated with Byzantium. And that's an ancient Greek colony where Hecate was its patron goddess. So you can see the depiction of her in the slide at the bottom there. And she was a Greek deity, and she was often depicted holding a pair of torches, a key, or snakes and dogs. So what's her connection to Byzantium? And it was really due to her saving the city from Philip II of Macedon in 340. So she warned the citizens of a nighttime attack by a light in the sky. So ultimately, she was responsible for the night, light, magic, protection from witchcraft, drugs, and the moon. And her origins came from Anatolia, where she originated from the Carians. And there's actually a cult site at Legina in Caria, and that is the largest temple for her in the Roman Empire. And there's a particular ritual that's associated with her there. It's a key carrying ceremony, and it consisted of a group of young girls who would walk from Legina to Stratonicia to declare their devotion to the city. And then on their way back, the gate would be opened by the girl carrying the keys. And then at that point, religious festivities would commence. So Hecate was also worshipped in Athens as a protector of the household, alongside Zeus, Hestia, Hermes, and Apollo. And she was a liminal deity. And what I mean by that is she resided between realms. And ultimately, she had the power to unlock the gates of death. And that's what connects her to the keys that she is sometimes seen carrying. So, as a result, she would have been a very appropriate deity to invoke in commemorative stones. So, I actually use a approach called prosopography, which I'm sure Dave has heard of because I spoke about that on Saturday. It's the study of names, and through it, I attempted to identify the ethnic background of women dedicated. As a result, 21% of the data set, so these female funerary tombstones, they were identified as Greek at 21%. And so they were either, it's a very tricky subject because ultimately, how can you decide if someone is Greek? But the names that were used were Greek, so that either they were Greek or they were Greek by association. So, considering the number of Greek women in Roman Britain, the star and crescent motif may have reflected cultural and religious practices which they'd brought into Britain. Now, I understand that 21% may not be a significant number. There are 110 female funerary inscriptions in Roman Britain, and so 21% of that are Greek women. However, I found during my research that sort of names that have been used, for instance, Celtic names have been used that I've identified through this approach, and they are not referred to directly as tribeswomen. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that they have this pre-Roman Iron Age association. And there are other examples of inscriptions in one inscription where the female is being accorded high status, yet in another inscription, for instance, a deity dedication, that same status is not being referenced. So I'm working with very limiting data, very limiting types of evidence that is not always consistent. So we need to just take the evidence from what we can get and really interpret that. So the epigraphic evidence also revealed individuals who embraced different cultures and religions, and that possibly may have been influenced by intermarriage. So although these women may not have been Greek, they may have been identified as such through the association with a family member or a husband. However, it's also important not to impose this onto individuals who may not have identified as Greek, but who may simply have embraced the Greek culture. And that's a very common representation, especially in inscriptions. And as we know, Roman Britain and across the Roman Empire was very ethnically diverse. So it's an aspect that we need to bear in mind. So the crescent and star motif, I'll go back to that again, that consisted of 10% of the crescent data set. So an example of that is the tombstone for Lucius Valerius Geminus, which you can see on the bottom right of the slide. That was erected in AD 60 to 80. So the trio nomina included the nomen Geminus, which possibly was connected to Geminus of Rhodes, who was a Greek astronomer and mathematician. Sometimes it feels like I'm stretching with these associations and trying to make connections where there are not connections. But if we can see that there's some connection to Greek culture, we need to address it. Even if there is a lack of evidence for it, even just a few is enough to really understand the goings on and status and identity in Roman Britain. So the crescent and star in that tombstone was placed at the top of the gabled tombstone, and that was possibly associated with Hecate. And the funerary inscription for Publio Vicana, you can see that on the top left on the slide. That's also presented with the crescent motif at the top, and that is a gabled tombstone as well. These gabled tombstones are very common, where they include this crescent moon right in the centre of it. So Publio Vicana's tombstone was stored at Corinium Museum in Cirencester, and that's where I conducted the epigraphic analysis. And when I conduct that analysis, I use a torch because sometimes you just can't see anything else that may be quite shallow engravings. And under torchlight, I actually identified a shallow star that was placed inside the crescent motif. And that was very interesting because I obviously was not expecting that. And at that time, I hadn't really researched into this meaning behind this crescent moon. So that was obviously very interesting and sort of contributes to this understanding to it possibly may have been a reference to Hecate. So the reference for Luna. The evidence for Luna in the epigraphic evidence is based on the absence of the star within the crescent motif. So any crescent that has no star within it, I'm sort of taking that as a reference to Luna. The crescent motif without the star then is represented at 89% of the crescent data set. So that's obviously a much larger representation. So possibly the lunar worship was to a larger degree greater than Hecate. The funerary inscription for Aurelia Sinecita, which you can see on the top left, is presented with a crescent moon at the top. And Aurelia is of Latin origin, which derives from Aurelius, and that means golden. And Senecita is also of Latin origin, and that derives from senectus, meaning old or aged. And it was also the name of a prominent Roman family associated with Seneca the Younger. So the Latinized nomens of the deceased is really in keeping with the deity Luna, who formed a part of the pantheon of Roman gods. The Roman deity in this tombstone may have referenced the deceased status as a Roman. Unfortunately, the rest of the inscription panel has been damaged, so the only part of the dedicator's name we can see is Julius Fortunatus. Unfortunately, that's just a curse of these tombstones, that they are vulnerable to the elements. And we're very lucky indeed to have some complete preserved examples of these stones. But most of the cases, they are very weathered or damaged. So we also have another source for Luna, and this is actually a building inscription from the Second Legion Augusta, and you can see that image on the bottom left. The building inscription is actually significant because it indicates the lunar imagery by the crescent, we can see that. But we can also see two horses, and that's particularly interesting. So this imagery was not only used in a civilian context, but it was also used in military spaces as well. So that's really key to consider. The building inscription was discovered at Corbridge, and the significance of the stone relates to the two horses. And that is the only stone present with the crescent in the data. And so Luna's association of the two horses, as I said previously, is because she's typically depicted driving a two-yoke chariot by two horses. Isidore of Seville stated the chariot represented the moon, and that was actually an important aspect of Mithraic iconography as well. And Mithraism was well attested across the Roman Empire, and more specifically in Roman Britain. And it was a cult which travelled across the empire through the Roman army. So the fact that this is in a military context, that makes sense. The cult typically travelled from Rome across Central and Northern Europe, and finally into Britain throughout the 1st to the 4th centuries. So Mithras was a Persian deity, and legend tells us he captured a bull, which was symbolic of primeval force and vitality, and he slew it in a cave to release its power for the good of mankind. So, although small temples were discovered, specifically at Korberg on Hadrian's Wall, the most significant find of Mithraism was discovered in London in 1954. That was dated to 240 to 350. And the Mithraeum, and that's a temple devoted to Mithras, that was discovered. It was consisted of walls, pillars, altars, and sculptures of Mithras. And there was one sculpture in particular that was dedicated by someone called Ulpius Silvanus of the Second Legion Augusta. So this military context of the inscription really validates that connection between the army and the cult. So in addition to the connection to Mithras, Hecate is also referenced through her driving a two-horse chariot. So within this building inscription, then, we have three deities referenced. We have Mithras, we have Luna, and we have a Hecate. So that's really indicating numerous deities were invoked in the erection of this inscription. And that's something I'm considering as we're looking into the meaning and the function of this motif. So the plural deities that were associated with it indicates possibly that its meaning was not exclusive to one deity, but was something that had changed over time, and was mainly dependent on the person who erected the stone, the date it was erected, and also the region. So this is the data that I've accumulated. So the data for crescent moon iconography can be divided into four categories. So we have funerary, we have deity, we have building, and we have emperor dedications. So I'm going to attempt to use a laser pointer can we all see that? I'm hoping that you can. So for funerary, we have Publia
Yes,
Vicana.
works perfectly well.
Brilliant. I've never used the pointer. So I'm just going to move that over there. Okay, so we have Publia Vicana, and there was a image in a few slides ago. So that's the one that I identified the shallow star up here. And she was dedicated by her husband, Publius Vitalis, and it was discovered in Cirencester in 1764. You can see the crescent is placed at the top, and as I said, the shallow star was inscribed right above it. And then we also have the tombstone for Julia Ingenuilla. Some of these names, honestly, I can't even pronounce. And that was discovered in Horsley in Gloucestershire in 1835. And you can see quite clearly, these are not rosettes. Quite clearly, it's a tombstone, and that was placed right at the top, just like Publia. And our third one we have is Tadia Valornius, and this is incredibly preserved. I believe at the in Wales, the museum in Wales, the Roman Legionary Museum. And it was a tombstone for Tadia Valornius and Tadia Exuperatus, and it was dedicated by their daughter Tadia Exuperata, and it was discovered in Caerleon in 1849. You can see the crescent, and that's placed at the top, but we can also see two rosettes on either side. And then we have Lucius Annius Marcellus, and he was of the Tromentine voting tribe. And the tombstone was discovered in Chester in 1887. The crescent here, you can see that is flanked by an orb right at the top there, with two lunula on either side. And I'm just gonna move that. Okay, we're down. Technology. Okay, and we also have Quintus Cornelius, and that's this one over here. And it was discovered in Chester in 1891. And you can see two crescent moons were placed on either side, with a rosette at the top. And then we also have this tombstone here for Setros, and it was dedicated by her husband Lemisius, and it was discovered at Old Penrith in Cumbria in 1599. And yeah, so, and then we also have, like I said before, Aurelius Senesita, and that was dedicated by Julius Fortunatus, discovered at Carlisle in 1828. And you can see the crescent there. And so the rest of these funerary inscriptions you can see. First one is Titulina Pacita, very well preserved. And that was, she was a Rhaetian from current day Austria, and that was discovered in Netherby in 1788. And you can see the crescent is placed at the top of the gabled tombstone, which is surrounded by two leaf motifs. And interestingly, Georgina, you may not be able to see it, but she's reaching down to a box, and there is a very small engraving of a crescent moon on the box. And that was dedicated by her Palmyrene husband Barates, and it was discovered in Southfield in 1878. And we also have the tombstone for Aurelius Aeginus, this one here, and it was dedicated by his father Aurelius Uticianus, discovered in Cirencester in 1971. And again, we can see this crescent moon at the top of the gabled shape. And then we also have Lucius Petronius, and that was dedicated by Comitinus, discovered at Cirencester in 1971. So the crescent is placed at the top of the gabled tombstone. Okay, and then we have deity, and there's not that much evidence for deity, but we do see some here. This is for the deity Mat, and Vitalis dedicated this, and to the divinity, to the emperor as well. And it was discovered in York in 1846. We can quite clearly see the crescent moon engraved there. And this one was for numerous people. I'm not going to Inseni Fesamiri, Berkani, I can't pronounce all of it. There's about 3 different people who had dedicated this. And it was discovered at Old Penrith in Cumbria in 1908. And the crescent, you can see a very maybe sloppy crescent, but a crescent nonetheless is right there. And then we also have Flaverius Severinus, who was a tribune, and he dedicated to Minerva at High Rochester, and that was discovered in 1810. And you can see very clearly 2 crescent moons here. And then we can see 3 rosettes and what appears to be 2 feathers above them. And lastly, we have Gaius Silvius Auspex, who he dedicated so much. And he was the prefect of the second cohort of Tungrians, and he dedicated to Minerva. And it was discovered at Birrens in Dumfriesshire in 1810. And you can see the crescent was placed at the top of the altar with 2 rosettes on either side, in addition to dolphins and birds. And we've got 3 more deities. So this one here is the Condrostrian districts of the second cohort of Tungrians, and they dedicated to Veridecthis, who was the protector goddess of the Condrusi, Belgic Germanic tribe in current day Belgium. And that was discovered at Birrens as well in 1772. And the crescent was placed right at the top. We're seeing a pattern here, aren't we? With 2 rosettes on either side. And this one here is Superstes and Regulus, who dedicated to Hyoteris, who was actually a Celtic god. And that deity was particularly popular among the ranks of the Roman army. And it was discovered in Housesteads on Hadrian's Wall in 1910. You can see another crescent that was engraved right at the top of the altar. And finally, we have Frumentius, He was a soldier of the second cohort of Tungrians, and he simply dedicated to all the gods and goddesses. He didn't want to miss anyone out. And that was discovered in Birrens as well in 1812. And we can see, instead of the top, we can see two crescent moons at the bottom, presumably because there wasn't enough space at the top where it's typically engraved. We only have one building with a crescent, and that was from the third cohort of the Second Legion Augusta, which was discovered at Corbridge in 1883. You can clearly see the crescent was placed right at the top, with I'm interpreting as two horses. However, I can see some wings going on here. So any thoughts at the end of my talk? Greatly appreciated on your thoughts on that. And lastly, we have emperor dedications. Again, not that many. So we're seeing majority of them are funerary and deity. But we have the first one, which is the military unit at Lugudunum, dedicated to the safe return of the Emperor Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus and of Caesar Publius Septimius Gato Augustus. And that was discovered at South Shields in 1672. And you can clearly see the crescent is placed right at the top there. And then we also have here the fourth cohort of Gauls, which was dedicated to the divinity of Severus Alexander, and that was discovered at Vindeland in 1702. Unfortunately, it's now lost, which is another curse of these inscriptions. And two crescents are placed on either side, and we can actually see, which I'm assuming is a representation of a star within the shape of this motif. And then we also have Silvius Auspex again, and he dedicated to the Emperor's victory, and that was discovered at Birrens in 1812. And you can see the crescent is placed right at the top. And lastly, I promise the last one, is Lucius Vinicius Pius, and he was prefect of the sixth cohort of the Nervians. That's in northern Gaul. And they had built the barrack block and dedicated it to Septimius Severus. And that was discovered at Broad by Brainbridge, which is in Yorkshire in 1960. And you can see the crescent right there. So we've moving on from the data now. Let's start thinking about this data analysis. So I've produced these pie charts in an aim to preserve my sanity because I'm at this point dreaming of crescent moons. So the type of inscription is predominantly funerary, and that's totaling 60% of the crescent data. So the crescent motifs were also used in data dedications, however, to a lesser degree at 30%. We do see emperor and building dedications, but hardly any. Like there's 4 emperor and maybe 6, like just one building. So although there's a range of contexts that were represented, funerary commemorations and deity dedications were represented to a greater degree. So the type of person who engaged with the motif was represented relatively equally. So males were represented at 45% and females at 28%. And in my head, that's equal. I don't know. I just get excited when we see an increase of female representation. And then military context at 27%. So the motif, I would say, is not a gendered practice because it was engaged with by both women and men, as well as civilian and military contexts. So it wasn't a gendered practice. And we can go further with that. We can go further with this analysis and say, okay, what about the status? Is this used by both high and low status groups? And that's really helping me to understand whether this is an elite signifier. So looking at the social status then, so to identify the social status of individuals in these inscriptions, I looked at the trio nomina. I looked at in tombstones lavish funerary scenes with the funerary relief, and as well as the person's occupation in addition to their trio nomina. So they're really communicating their status. So high status totaled 59% and low status 41%, which exasperated me, to be honest, because I really wanted it. It makes you think, oh, it's a very elite motif, it's a very elite thing, and that would be the end of the day. But unfortunately not. It's not always so simple as this, is it? So the result revealed individuals of both high and low social rank, and that indicates the crescent was not a signifier of status. So I've got a picture there on the slide on the left, and that's an altar dedicated to Minerva, and it was erected by Flavius Severinus, who was a tribune. So that's just showing that this example of a high status. He was a senior officer in the Roman army, and he commanded legions, bodyguards, units, and auxiliary cohorts. So, as well as his role of tribune, that potentially connected him with the Senate. So we're seeing that high status there. So I also looked at the geographic distribution. This is quite a late incomer to this talk. I wasn't going to think about the geographic distribution, but I actually am really glad that I did now, because it revealed something very significant. So if we look at the distribution of the stones across Roman Britain, we can see that they're represented, all across Roman Britain, really. But if we look a bit deeper and consider the types of inscription, types of sites that are represented, we can see that these stones are exclusively all erected at forts. And that blew my mind. I don't know whether it blew your mind, but it did for me. So this motif was exclusively associated at military sites, and therefore the Roman military. So where we see funerary inscriptions erected for women, looking at the location of the tombstone it was erected in, they were associated with the military. So whether by marriage, whether they had a brother or something of that nature. So was this a Roman motif that was related to the Roman army and ultimately was a symbol of the expansion of the Roman Empire? So if we look at the only piece of research on crescent moons, which I mentioned at the beginning, the author Sekar stated that this was a symbol of Roman eternity. So he published that article on the symbol of the crescent moon with a star on ancient and medieval coins as well as stones. And he said that this motif was recorded on coins where the imagery of Tarpeia, who was a daughter of a Roman army commander, was on the hill of the capital. So Tarpeia and the Sabines formed a significant part of the formation and foundation of Rome, and ultimately was associated with other heroes such as Aeneas and Romulus. So the moon and the star then, was it symbolic of Rome's predestination, and its placement in proximity to forts may have referred to Rome's expansion in Britain? There's a few other things that I'm going to introduce to this, but we'll move on to materiality. So materiality focuses on how people experience material objects and how these objects impact on the person's lives and thoughts. So materiality in archaeological discourse is typically defined through the association between people and things. However, I think we need to go a bit deeper than that and consider the phenomenon of object distribution and its transformation and its use across different time periods and regions. So using trace to define what we mean by materiality introduces not a focus on the object itself, but the changes made through time of the meaning of the object. So considering the reference to Roman eternity and its proximity to forts, the motif was used to solidify the Roman culture in what some would perceive as a difficult province. On the other hand, the motif's possible deity reference, it was just not consistent enough. And ultimately, I felt that we can't rely on this aspect to definitively interpret its meaning. So throughout the changes of the crescent motif, we can start to to think about the consistent meaning behind this object. Furthermore, the crescent moon motif is actually still in use today, mainly in Wiccan practices. You can see an image of a Wiccan necklace that is being sold on Etsy. So, paganism and Gothic culture that was associated with the crescent moon and associated with witchcraft, feminine power, intuition, and psychic visions. Interestingly, Hecate is, well, she is still now worshipped by contemporary pagans, and she's considered to be the goddess of witchcraft. But her origins, such as being the key holder or representative of the sky, earth, and sea, have been long forgotten, and people have hyper focused on the witchcraft element. But the star and the moon is also a symbol of Islam, and which, funnily enough, originates from Byzantium and was actually kept in use by Muslim leaders after the 7th century. I say funnily enough because that's where Hecate originated from. So, religion and spirituality then was and is a consistent theme associated with the crescent moon, and it's used throughout different time periods and is even in practice to this day. So, although the deity which was associated with it altered, spirituality and religiosity was applied in every example. So, the context in which the motif was used then was predominantly militaristic and religious in nature, as well as this concept of Roman eternity, which was really built into Roman religion, and that is indicative of a strong association with that military life and the religious life. So, looking at the meaning and function and kind of bringing all these points together, the meaning and function of the crescent moon was predominantly militaristic and religious in nature. And the motif itself had Byzantium origins, where Hecate was the patroness. And as Roman culture adopted this iconography, different deities, different concepts were invoked. The Roman army was a contributing factor to the movement of the iconography, so where Mithraism was practiced in Roman Britain. And the different deities that were associated with the relief indicate to me that they were not important, but it was the motif which communicated military and religious connotations. As a result, it is difficult to interpret the individuals who engaged with the motif and ultimately their status and ethnicity, as it was practiced across the Roman Empire by individuals of all social ranks. As it was used in all contexts of Romano-British society by all different types of persons, the crescent indicates, I think, a freedom of religion that surpassed race, gender, and status. The fact that it surpassed all status really tallies up with this idea that the motif expressed Roman eternity, a concept ultimately applicable to all persons. So the motif is limited in its ability to identify connections to key structures in the ancient world. However, it can also tell us that this cult spread far and was not exclusive in its use. So the widespread of this motif was associated with the widespread of the Roman Empire. And it's probable that the crescent moon was a symbol for the expansion of Rome. So I'm just going to summarize everything that I've said. So the crescent moon was directly associated with spiritual and religious activities. It was used by all persons, irrespective of their gender or their race or status. And the origins came from Byzantium, which was associated with Hecate. However, in time, it was also connected with Luna and Mithras as different cults spread across the Roman Empire. The motif crossed boundaries in society, and although represented to a lesser degree, it was also present in building and emperor dedications, indicating its practice was widely accepted. And this use of the materiality approach really allowed me to identify the movement and the altering of the motif, where it was recorded across the Roman Empire where spirituality and religion was pretty much a consistent theme. So the crescent moon then was far more significant than the deity invoked and was universal across the Roman Empire. The motif is still in use today. However, there's been a shift in its meaning, where it's mainly focused on feminine power and supernatural concepts. However, its spiritual association remains in place. I hope you enjoyed my talk and would welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.